Episode 76, Colonial Wine, the tedious and extensive reasons why there wasn't any in the 17th and 18th centuries. Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week, I'll be looking at the American grape situation and how it meant there was no colonial wine in the North American British Colonies. It's full of chemical warfare, the pitfalls of early botany, and the problem with scientific arrogance when it comes to things we can't see. So pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is that phylloxera is still a problem over 200 years after it was noticed, identified, and started to be understood. And that is mainly because they are the product of at least hundreds of thousands of years of chemical and biological warfare with grapevines. They've had millennia to adapt. Unimaginative humans are no match for them, especially when humans have profit as their motive, but for the phylloxera, it's survival. Unless you're a bit of a wine person or a bug person, you are probably wondering, what is phylloxera? And is it food? And if not, why all the airtime? Phylloxera is a bug. It looks like something between an aphid and a louse. It can be winged or not, is about 1 millimeter long, and wiped out 80% of the European wine-producing stock in the 19th century. Explaining how and why this happened requires me to, once again, share some history and then bring us up to the 18th century. Grapes. Like apples and citrus and roses, there are a bunch of species, and for the most part, the different species are pretty good at crossing with each other. Also, like apples and citrus, while there are many species with a jillion wild crosses and experiments on multiple continents, there are only a limited number of varieties of a few species that we humans like, and those are the ones we cultivate. On the wide Eurasian landmass, there were likely several species of wild grapes, but there's only one that humans have repeatedly bothered with, Vitis sylvestre. A version of this vine was selected and bred into its domesticated Vitis vinifera form. Current historical and archaeological evidence places the epicenter of viniculture in the area of Georgia, that stretch of land between the Black and the Caspian Seas. This is where the oldest evidence of organized, large-scale winemaking is located as well. From the beginning, organized human interaction with grapes has rested on wine. So what distinguishes a wild grape from domesticated Vitis vinifera? Besides selected fruit characteristics, the big difference is that the V. vinifera flowers are complete flowers. They contain the pistil and the stamen. Pollen and eggs are both present in each bloom, so the vines are able to easily self-pollinate and keep the line breeding true. Wild grapevines, on the other hand, are dioecious. There are male plants and female plants, so all new baby V. sylvestre vines are new genetic combinations. We've encountered this male-female plant situation in squash and in nutmegs, and the need to be pollinated by a different plant in apples and corn. The constant creation of new variations is great for creating variety and survival of the species, but for creating a consistent agricultural product, it is a disaster. Unless, of course, you control the pollination, or give up growing from seeds and only start new plants from grafting. As we've seen, both of these solutions are used by humans. With corn, controlled pollination was the solution, while with apples, we turned to grafting, unless we're on the hunt for like a new variety or something. And with some plants, vines particularly, a cutting can be rooted to start a new plant. Pineapples as bromeliads also do this with their pup growths. And it was rooting clippings that became the preferred method with grapevines. Even with the complete flowers of V. vinifera, there's always a chance for change when the chromosomes reshuffle in the making of seeds. But more to the point, starting with cuttings and getting them to root is just faster for getting a new vine going. This is great news when you want your vineyard to produce wagon loads of grapes with all the same characteristics. The downside, of course, is that now you have acres and acres of clones. A disease or pest that takes out one will likely take them all. In medieval Europe, this was not a huge problem since every hillside, every village, every opposite side of the river, while they each might be growing something that was a vivinifera grape, they were all different varieties. So maybe a few acres of clones, but not the square miles of clones we are producing in some types of modern agriculture today. There were likely other species of European wild grapes, but they were done in by the Little Ice Age of the 16th century, if they had even made it that far. And the tendency for humans to move into areas wild grapes like to grow and then replace them with a preferred domesticated vivinifera did in the rest. And before the global agricultural swap that's about to begin in the 16th century, that is where the grape situation stood in Europe. And before we head over there, it's important to talk about what was going on in England with grapes and wine. What were the attitudes and knowledge bases that were being accessed when deciding to do vineyards in the New World? England has, on and off, had a domestic wine industry. The first one rose up during the Roman occupation in the 1st century CE. It's possible at this time there were wild grapes, but who cares? The Romans brought their vivinifera vines and were mostly frustrated with the low outputs of the sun-starved plants. They resorted to mostly drinking beer, some ciders, and complaining, then giving up and leaving because the combination of mildew, cranky Celts, and the Viking pirates were just too much. The Normans with their French roots brought in grapes again, along with the better cider apples, and these grapes were babied along through the warm periods in the developing lands of the growing Christian church. Sacramental wine was important, and they made it work. And at this point, awareness of wine and grapes were spread around Europe pretty well. Between the surprisingly active medieval trade networks and the spread of the Catholic Church, grape wine was even known to the Vikings. When Leif Erikson and his crew bonked into Canada in the 9th century around the area of New Brunswick, they named it Vinland, either Vineland or Wineland. Regardless, the grapevines they found were recognized for what they were. For the rich people who didn't work for the church, a wine trade was developing between England and France, Portugal, and Spain. The shortest boat trips to somewhere with good weather for grapes, kind of like how lots of English tourists see the world now. Over time, as distilling technology was on the rise and fruit brandies were developed, it was discovered that if wine was fortified with brandy, it traveled better. It didn't go sour. The Romans had figured out something similar back in their heyday because they had traded in a sort of wine concentrate as well. They figured out that a high enough alcohol content kept wine more drinkable for longer, which is why drinking unwatered wine in Roman literature was always a mark of hedonism. It's like The Simpsons, where Bart and Milhouse get a squishy that's all syrup. You knew they were up to no good. The normal order of the day in 16th century England was that there was sacramental and or abbey wines for people in the church. There was wine for regular rich people. That was a bit chancy as it came in barrels. But then there was port, the fortified wine mostly from Portugal, which had brandy added, and so it would keep much longer. Wine was bottled a bit by the time we get to the 16th century, but it was still mostly stored in and drunk from barrels. Glass was still really expensive and rare and mostly used to store medicines and, of course, show off. And then several things happened at once. Henry VIII decided he was done with the Catholic Church, and so he broke up the monasteries. So the monks and lay brothers who had been caring for grapes in the marginal climate of England were largely tossed out onto the streets, so to speak, and the low point of the Little Ice Age hit. So whatever grape cultivation that had still been going on in England ended pretty abruptly. The combination of weather turning and expertise being hounded out of their vineyards was the end of any sort of local English wine industry for the next several centuries. So from there were lots of fights just waiting to happen as England fought with different kingdoms and countries that also supplied their wine. There was conflict, and to vastly oversimplify for the common people and even the not-so-rich nobility, England became mainly an ale, cider, and mead country until they discovered gin. Why this matters is that as much as the English colonists desperately wanted to create a wine industry in obviously warmer North America, by the time they were setting up colonies, no one living in England was that good at growing grapes. And at that point, all or nearly all agricultural knowledge was learned on the job. The best agricultural businesses usually had 2 or 3 generations of knowledge to draw upon. The very idea of writing agricultural manuals was a novelty. And as we have seen before, the English tended not to send many farmers in their early batches of colonists. And unlike growing grain, which is pretty straightforward, it's an annual crop and no worrying about overwintering, growing grapevines to bear grapes for making wine profitably requires a high level of expertise. Making things even trickier is that while wheat or squash or beans are simply food, you grow it, you harvest it, you eat it, or you store it and then you eat it, grapes for wine require some tricky further processing. And to make matters worse, you don't get grapes right away. It takes a few years for grapevines to produce enough fruit to make wine, even if you start from cuttings instead of seeds. So there's an upfront investment of money needed, which means growing grapes for wine is an investment, and someone is looking for a return on that investment. Sugar and tobacco make you money every year as soon as that first crop is planted. But setting up a vineyard and making wine to sell takes a bunch of upfront cash, and then the ability to wait for returns. And so the people most likely to have these means are not the people carrying around a lot of farming knowledge. And because we're talking English people who've been out of the grape game for a while, even if they do have farming knowledge, they don't know about growing grapes. Add to that, they don't know about the weather patterns of the New World, and things start to look dark, and then it only gets worse. As the colonists arrived, they saw that this New World side of the Atlantic, there was a grape bonanza. North America holds at least 10 species of wild grapes and maybe a few more. Like many plants, grapes only existed on one side of the equator or the other, but they managed to be on more than one continent. One important thing these colonists and early naturalists did not know is that this proliferation of grape species meant that North American grapes had been subject to a series of challenges: climatic, soil types, and possibly most important, pests, bugs, and various forms of rot. It was because of all of these challenges that so many grapes had proliferated. If there hadn't been challenges, there would have been no reason to adapt and change and adapt again. But this is only late 20th and 21st century botanical understanding. In the 18th century, it looked like grape paradise. If there's all these wild grapes, then clearly it will be perfect for the grapes we already like. And so the grape imports began. At this point, the English saw grapes as only for wine and raisins, and it seems they weren't altogether clear on the raisin thing. The English had some dried fruits in their local repertoire, mostly apples and dried plums, and they also imported what they called raisins of the sun and Zante currans, or currants. The raisins of the sun, which came to be simply known as raisins, were usually larger dried grapes from France and Spain. And since raisin is French for grape, that's definitely one of those food words where the French hangs on to the version used in the kitchen, while the unprocessed one has the English name. Yep, right back to cow and beef and sheep and mutton. Oh, and raisins tended to get called plums when baked into a cake or a pudding. Growing up, I thought plum duff was some fluffy, possibly whipped creamy thing flavored with or studded with juicy purple plums, and I was disappointed to find out that it is actually heavy, dense, boiled suet pudding with raisins in it. Anyway, the English weren't done with their calling fruit what it isn't. The Zante currants are possibly even more confusing. Here's the thing. The English had local currants, which are the fruit of bushes in the ribes genus, which is not at all related to the vitis genus that contains grapes. Currants in England in the 16th and 17th centuries were eaten fresh or crushed for their juice, and by the 18th century were even being made into jam. But they were too low in sugar and contained too much water to dry on their stems the way some grapes do. The way these teeny, tiny, very sweet grapes from the eastern end of the Mediterranean do, especially. And so when a little dried black fruit showed up for sale from overseas called raisins de Corinth or raisin de Corinth, as far back as the 12th or 13th century, they got Englishified into Zante currants, a name which made sense to the English who saw few, if any, grapes, but saw currants and withered currants every summer and fall. The 17th and 18th century cookbooks I have refer to Zantes, Zante currants, or dried currans, and I'm fairly certain most cooks had no idea they were actually small dried grapes from islands that we identify today as Greek, but they likely thought of themselves as Roman or Byzantine at that point. The English were using dried grapes, but most people simply assumed they were dried currants, so most people associated grapes only with wine and maybe a bit with raisins. But for the most part, the fresh grape and how it grew was largely a mystery. And so, in the 17th and 18th century, these men of grand hopes arrived in the New World with many a scheme planned in their heads. They were going to start silk farms, since there were mulberries. They were going to grow sugar in the Carolinas and Virginia. They were going to dry salt around Boston. They were going to hunt for whales for oil. They were going to run massive dairy farms on the rolling hills of New Jersey. They were going to do a lot of things. But these investing and dreaming men soon realized all of these ventures take time. They take an astounding amount of work. They require climatic conditions that didn't exist, and they require specialized equipment, and they require knowledge that most of these men simply didn't have. Does this sound familiar at all? Now, some of these issues were addressed by a shift in place or time. Barbados and Jamaica became the homes for sugar, and the Carolinas hosted rice instead, while Virginia grew tobacco. Salt changed from drying in the sun to mining from the ground once the salt deposits of the New World were discovered. Harping irons and Dutch expertise solved the whaling knowledge gap in the 19th century, and the importing of humans to do labor for no pay in the meanest of circumstances solved the problem of moving trees and earth in staggering quantities to coax wealth out of the ground as crops. But there were some problems that remained insoluble. The silk trade was started several times using silkworm caterpillars smuggled out of China or Japan or Turkey or the Byzantine Empire, but it always foundered. The scientists and natural philosophers of the day hadn't figured out that caterpillars and moths and butterflies are pickier than we think. They not only specialize in one genus of plant or tree, they usually are specific down to one or two species, and the mulberry of the New World was not satisfactory as fodder for the silkworm of Asia, and the climate was unsuited as well. A similar set of problems beset the eager and hopeful grape growers and winemakers setting up shop in eastern North America. There was ample proof that growing European grapes in the New World was possible when different Catholic orders, especially the Jesuits, had set up shop in different regions of New Spain. They had planted vineyards which were doing a satisfactory job of supplying sacramental wine and maybe a little bit more. This is one of the funny things I observed when I took, finally, my first trip to Spain. It looks an awful lot like the hills of Southern California where I spent 7 years of my young adulthood, all the way down to the oak trees. When the Pilgrims and the Jamestown guys landed in Virginia and Massachusetts, they were put off by the cold, the heat, the humidity, the bugs, and weirded out by the porcupines and the skunks. When the Spanish emerged from the tropical jungles of the Yucatan and made it to western Mexico, the hills of Texas, and the foothills of the peaks of California, they simply said to themselves, check it out, more Spain. And there's lots of things that created these similar conditions that 16th, 17th, 18th, and even 19th century explorers didn't understand, but made it so anyway. The Coriolis effect and some big rivers of air that flow down the west coast of North America and across Mexico have much in common with what's going on down the west coast of Europe and across Spain. Oh, and the continental divide made up of the Rocky Mountains, the southwestern deserts, and the Sierra Madre Oriental did their part to cut the west coast off from the pests and diseases that bothers plants on their east side. There are native grapes in California, Arizona, and Texas, but these are small, seedy, full of tannins, and are pulpy rather than juicy, reflecting their dry living conditions. And so the dry adapted grape types coming over from Spain did well in these similar climates, but things were different on the East Coast. Most of the different species of grapes in North America exist on the east side of the continental divide. To modern botanists, this is a signal that these grapes face challenges, a bunch of challenges and that they had adapted. Our intrepid English grape importers were about to discover these challenges as well. First, and most obvious to them, was the weather. While both England and the New World get quite cold in the winter, the places where the French grape cuttings they were working with didn't get that cold, and they definitely didn't face the ice storms that southern states are subject to. But even more importantly, they don't get as hot, and they definitely don't get as humid. This meant that interesting sorts of mildew were able to grow on the cuttings that survived the winter storms that caught these early vintners off guard. Along with the muggy weather, there seems to have been a tendency to plant grapes in soil that didn't drain as well as the soils they had come from, and this led to a plant disease that was named the black rot. Some of the problems with planting lay in the speculative vineyards being laid out and set up by investors and landowners, not by people who deeply understood, due to their own personal years of working with vines, what conditions were needed for grapevines to flourish. Fine. Eventually, after planting hundreds and even thousands of these rooted vine clippings, speculators conceded that they might want to get people here with some expertise. They'd seen that grain farmers had done much better at growing wheat and rye and buckwheat and even this alien corn than soldiers and displaced city folks seeking God. So maybe it was time to start importing some vine dressers. Maybe growing grapes successfully required specialized knowledge, so some Frenchmen and German colonists were recruited. And so, the next wave of grape vineyards was attempted, this time with French or German expertise coming along to choose locations, the layout of the vines, and the timing of the planting. Now, they were in business. The vines rooted, they started to grow, and yet, after a few years of promising growth, the young vines would wither and die. Often the leaves would be covered with these strange little nodules before they fell off, and the roots of the withered dead plants would be shrunken and useless. Something else was wrong. But in this awakening of the scientific age, there was turmoil, excitement, and a tendency to leap after the shiny, exciting things. And as always, for these men we hear about in the historical record, these were guys with a profit motive, or at least a desire for recognition in mind. Many were inspired to skip to the end, successful wine production, instead of taking a systematic approach, which in this case would mean bringing all the new scientific tools of the age to bear on this mystery. But the systematic approach on plant disease mysteries doesn't get you money. It might get you recognition, eventually, but not money. So thousands more grape cuttings were imported to ever new and more ideally situated places. They rooted, they sprouted, they began life, and every last one of them would eventually wither and die. What was going on? Grapes had been successfully imported to the west coast of North America, and in the next century they would be successfully imported to South Africa and Australia. So what was going on in the British colonies? It was a bug. This phylloxera thing I opened the episode with. This is the pest that had been conducting a long, drawn-out battle with American grapes. The grapes side upping its arsenal of defensive weapons, and the phylloxera side upping its offensive weaponry and avoidance tactics. So while the pampered, domesticated Vitis vinifera walked into the fray, it had all the defensive capabilities of a puff of cotton candy in a rainstorm. So it's a doozy, this phylloxera. I was always a little frustrated with the description I'd gotten of the bug. They were truncated along the lines of, it's a tiny bug, it wiped out most of European winemaking, but now we graft European grapevines onto American rootstock and it's all better now. And that would be it. Granted, the explanation was usually at a vineyard when I was there to taste wine, and I did have other things I was more interested in. So, I have looked into it, and what I found was a life cycle that shows the results of a long drawn-out and relatively continuous war between bug and plant. The grapevines have resorted to chemical warfare, the phylloxera have resorted to a range of adapted evolutionary strategies that make the Pokemon transformations seem straightforward by comparison. I mean, if I gave a nest of vampires all the reproductive and generative options these bugs have developed, you'd kick me out of your fanfic group for being too ridiculous. With that in mind, let me explain the strategies the little bugs employ to keep their population going and how the American grapes fight back. Phylloxera have 4 distinct body types as a population moves around a grapevine. And within those 4 body types, there are up to 18 stages of maturity. And a growing season can produce up to 17 generations of the bugs across the 4 types. Like I said, this is proof of a long, drawn-out plant versus bug war. And as a result, some of the forms of this tiny bug don't even eat. They just produce a new generation. Some of the eggs appear through sexual reproduction, and some are produced by parthenogenesis. That is, a female bug with no interaction with any other bug just lays a bunch of eggs, all female clones of herself for what it's worth. Some live on the leaves, some live in the roots, some stay put, some can crawl, and some can fly. Any chemical that takes out one stage will simply miss others. It's the ultimate catch me if you can. The simplest place to start is at the point that feels the most familiar. In the spring, a fertilized egg hatches to produce a female fundatrix, and she crawls out of her starting spot in the grapevine stem, moves up to the leaves where she parthenogenically produces another all-female generation. These will also parthenogenically, that is, asexually, produce another 3 or 4 generations, each bug laying 200 to 400 eggs. Some of these offspring crawl down and feed on the roots, some stay on the leaves, feed on them, and each generation may crawl up or down the plant. In the late summer or fall, it's time to switch up the playbook. Some of the females that moved to the roots and fed there will move up to the vine and will lay eggs that hatch into male and female bugs. These are the bugs that only live long enough to mate, lay a single sexually produced egg in the stem, and die. They can't live any longer. They can't eat as they don't have a digestive system. And this is the egg that will overwinter and start the whole cycle all over again. But wait, there's more. Some of the females that moved into the roots in the summer will develop into winged versions, allowing them to fly, or more realistically, to be caught in breezes and blown onto other plants. There they can lay male and female eggs and start the cycle all over on a new plant. Or wingless crawlers from the root-feeding females can crawl into moist soil cracks or even ride upon rivulets of water to other plants, and then also lay the male and female eggs and start the whole cycle over on a new plant. And the root-inhabiting forms can simply continue to cycle without even bursting into the leaf-eating form. So you can have a vine that appears clean with just a few tiny invisible or nearly invisible root nodules on it that will get past someone who doesn't know what they're looking for until it's moved to new grounds and new prey grapevines abound, and then the leaf-feeding form will burst forth and take advantage of all the fresh hunting grounds. And several of these stages can all exist all at once. Like I said, you'd hate a vampire written this way because they could just replicate and reproduce and travel and hibernate any old which way. Eastern American grapes have figured out ways to fight back, often by having thicker bark, tougher roots, and the ability to produce thicker sap in their stems and roots. Some are cold hardy, some are drought tolerant, and each of these strategies slows and inhibits the beasties enough to allow the vines to stay ahead of their predators. The different species of grapes also have earlier and later fruiting habits in the season, and the tendency to have grape bunches that ripen unevenly, allowing a wider range of time for seeds to become ready. All of this, along with them being dioecious, that is, possessing male and female plants, which guarantees greater genetic diversity in their offspring. Having no chance to self-fertilize means more chances for hardier offspring that can survive the next onslaught of Phylloxera's next attack. Vitis vinifera had none of these things, and since they possess complete flowers, that is, the male and female parts in close proximity, they usually self-fertilize, severely limiting the diversity of their offspring. Again, great for producing predictable products for an industry, not such a great survival strategy. It would also inhibit the strategy that would accidentally be stumbled upon in the next century, hybridization. But it does happen, and I'll talk about that when we get there. But where do we end up in the 18th century, before the Revolutionary War? we end up with no wine industry, just wine imports. But was any wine being made? Oh yes, but it was all for personal use, never for export. And most likely, most of it wasn't even sold, not even locally, and it was likely quite sweet. From Virginia to the Carolinas, there are 5 species of American grape that seemed promising. They were some combination of juicy and cooperative. These were Vitis aestivalis, Vitis rotundifolia, Vitis labrusca, Vitis riparia, and Vitis vulpina. It's this last grape, Vitis vulpina, that hints at one of the best-known issues with American grapes. They can have a muskiness, a sort of furry predator animal scent, what came to be called foxiness, that is noticeable in their raw form and in the wine they produce. Considering what I have said about beer, cider, and rum produced in homes of the 17th and 18th century so far, a whiff of fox in one's wine would not have been off-putting to the home winemaker of the time. So winemaking from the American grapes was definitely happening right alongside or even in combination with cider making. Mulberries, strawberries, peaches, and plums were all used to make wines and cordials and vinegars, either helped along by sugar or not, depending on the location, knowledge, and cash availability of the winemaker, as well as which decade of the century they were in. But these were not wines for sale and certainly not the basis of a wine industry, where merchants were looking for a dependable product with the characteristics appealing to the sort of person who had the money to purchase wine. So in the 18th century, there were American grapes, and there was American wine being made, but not at an industrial scale and certainly not for wide sale. And except for a brief flash here and there was no wine being made from the European Vitis vinifera grapes. If you wanted real wine, you had to import it. And that's the way things will stay well into the 19th century, when I come back and look at how phylloxera came close to wiping out European wine and how we learned nothing from that near calamity. Join me next week when it's time for the colonies to get drunk enough to revolt. Now that the early industrial scale distillation has been sorted out, there's more rum and there are hints of whiskey. There's lots to fight about around taxes, and while the stuff is not great, punch and mixed drinks are coming along in the taverns. Thanks for listening. Any email, questions, or quibbles will reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com or on Twitter while it lasts. I'm working on showing up on post.news and Instagram as well, all as THOA Food. Your ratings and reviews and comments on your favorite podcast widget help make the show more visible, as does your very own word of mouth. Show notes for this episode will be at thehistoryofamericanfood.blogspot.com. Along with promised pictures and links, I'll also include any interesting media I consumed for the episode. And going up is my ever-growing bibliography. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle, and the link to the show notes is also in the show's social media at THOA Food and in the show description.